Hello and welcome to Faith Evolving. My name is Mary Claire, and today we're going to be doing a microscopic analysis of just 8 verses in the Bible, more specifically, that time where Elijah took a couple naps. As many of you know, I'm currently in seminary, also known as Grad School for Jesus, and one major skill that my classmates and I are developing is biblical exegesis. And now maybe you're like, whoa there, exegesis? Wow, these progressive Christians are really saying the quiet part out loud now, aren't they? Wrong. Exegesis is the critical explanation or interpretation of a text, especially with scripture. This is important work because so much is lost with just a surface level reading. We miss out on all this context that I talk about so much, that I love so much. Throughout this past semester for my Hebrew Bible course, we've being my classmates and I, been focusing on a small chunk of scripture of our choosing within 1 Kings 17, 18, or 19, and dissecting it and analyzing it from a bunch of different angles. In my case, I've been studying 1 Kings 19, 1 through 8, which is, as I said up top, that time when an exhausted Elijah went out to the middle of nowhere, took a few naps, ate a few snacks, and then rallied. In this video, I'll be smashing together all of the papers that I've written on this topic into one body of work. Thus, I'm going to be paraphrasing a lot more than I did in my original research. So I'm going to pop up my sources on the screen when it's relevant as a footnote of sorts. After all, if I want to be a scholar, I better do my due diligence with proper citations. It's the bare minimum. No plagiarizing here. And on our tour today, I will be taking you through a historical analysis, a structural analysis, comparing translations, a literary analysis, and then finally, at the end, drawing out some theological implications. And together, hopefully, if my argument is well crafted, we'll uncover that through intense exegetical study of 1 Kings 19, 1 through 8, one finds God's historic care for those fleeing power and crying out in the wilderness. So take this moment to hit that like button, subscribe, maybe ring that notification bell. And without further ado, here is the NRSV translation of our story. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat. Otherwise, the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. I'm going to be completely honest with you all. My script is really long, so if you see me looking down and just reading directly from it, mind your own business. Thank you. So anyway, historical analysis. History is important to consider while reading the Bible because it helps determine the setting of a particular passage, provides clues for dating its composition, and gives background knowledge on certain nouns referenced in a work. For example, let's take 1 Kings 19, 1 through 8. It's just a small sliver within 1st and 2nd Kings, let alone the whole Bible. However, honing into 1st and 2nd Kings overall can help ground it a little bit. So 1st and 2nd Kings, those two books were originally one collection, and you'd find them within the Christian Bible around like 1/4, maybe 1/3 of the way through. They're suspected to be part of the Deuteronomistic, try saying that a lot of times, history, which is a whole other story. But that whole kind of authorship period of writing likely happened during the Babylonian exile, which is a really important event in the history of the Israelites as just being a group of people. Another probably whole other video. But the Babylonian exile is really important, and it was super traumatizing. However, the stories contained within 1st and 2nd Kings likely fall between somewhere in the 10th and the 6th centuries BCE. And the Babylonian exile happened in 586-ish era times, so it's looking retroactively back at the rise and the fall of the monarchy of the Israelites and the Judeans, because Israel and Judah split. It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing we're going to get into. To get an idea for the general themes during this period, Chun-Liang Sao offers up this. The story of 1st and 2nd Kings as a whole testifies to divine purposefulness and the messiness of history. Thus, knowledge of both the messy history in the region as well as the religious divine imagery utilized is crucial to understanding the text. I will now present to you information regarding the important people, places, and things, specifically in 1 Kings. Oh, she's a little poet and she didn't know it. I hate myself. 19, 1 through 8.
First up, people.
Let's start with King Ahab because we have a fair amount of extra biblical records regarding his reign. He was a pretty good king by political standards during his 22 years as the northern Israel king. He continued the policies set forth by his father, including getting along with the southern kingdom of Judah, thriving domestic affairs, including many ivory constructions specifically. Homeboy loved ivory, and keeping good relations with the Phoenicians. This Phoenician alliance was further solidified through his marriage to Queen Jezebel. Unfortunately, Ahab's closeness with the Phoenicians also included worship of their storm god, Baal, which forever tarnished his biblical reputation. And Jezebel is one of the most controversial characters in the Bible. The biblical text portrays her as a devout worshiper of foreign gods,
which, if the shoe fits, wear it. She was from a foreign place. Phoenicia wasn't a part of Israel or Judah.
Who used her feminine wiles to lead her husband astray. Over time, the name Jezebel has essentially become synonymous with evil temptress. Even the ancient Christian commentary on scripture, which is not a resource I particularly enjoyed reading, couldn't help but allow disdain for Jezebel to seep into their analysis. They call her, and I'm not making this up, an insane woman who couldn't have possibly been the one to strike fear into Elijah's heart. In contrast, Dr. Wilda Gaffney asserts that Jezebel is the power of the throne. She is not the power behind the throne. So when the story of Elijah butchering her prophets makes its way to the palace, the king's immediate response is to tell Jezebel. Jezebel has not usurped Ahab's authority. He has yielded it to her. When Elisha hears that she has put a hit out on him for killing some of her prophets, he runs away to cower in a cave. His fear is real because her power is real. But amidst all her controversy and terrible biblical reputation, Jezebel's historicity, which is just a fancy word meaning historical proof, remains hazy. There are some records of the name Jezebel in a Phoenician seal. Yet such seals were often used mostly by wealthy merchants rather than royalty. It is then plausible that Jezebel was a businesswoman during the time of Ahab rather than his particular Phoenician wife, and they just decided to name her Jezebel. Nevertheless, Jezebel continues to face most of the heat regarding Ahab's messy religious affiliations, even though she might not have actually even existed. And now Elijah himself is an extremely famous, especially in death, 9th century prophet, first mentioned in 864 BCE during Ahab's reign. His primary biblical purpose was warning Ahab against worshiping foreign gods. Ahab notably didn't listen, and Elijah is a near supernatural figure throughout his biblical story arc. He even, instead of dying a normal death, is just like taken up by like a whirlwind of a chariot because he's too special to just like croak like a normal human being. So overall, he acts more as a mythic figure rather than a historical one. Thus, the sources I consulted focus more on his general lore rather than his historicity. I think he's supposed to be larger than life. I would even argue that trying to prove his literal existence kind of misses the point a little bit, but I'm just a baby scholar in training, so you can write off everything I've ever said if you really want to. I don't have a doctorate, and we know a doctorate is everything in the world of academia. Places, everyone. In verse 3, Elijah flees to Beersheba, which is located at the very edge of Judah, which is the southern kingdom. And since Judah and Israel were split at this point, he was no longer in Jezebel/Ahab's territory by fleeing that far. Beersheba was also an important location for the tribal patriarchs before the monarchy happened, especially those talked about in Genesis. So Abraham, Father Abraham, who had the many sons, planted a tree in Genesis, more on trees later, and Sharon Pace actually writes, in addition to the city, the wilderness of Beersheba becomes a locus where the divine presence may be encountered. In Beersheba's vicinity, Hagar, who's also in Genesis and part of the Abraham storyline, wandered with Ishmael before God intervened to save their lives. In later generations, the prophet Elijah, oh my gosh, we know him, first stops in Beersheba when he escapes Jezebel's plan to have him killed. These references are further connected by Elijah's continuation away from Beersheba and into the wilderness further beyond God's promised land. But wilderness contains a myriad of meanings. Sometimes it simply indicates a geographic location, though events that take place in the wilderness are often transformative. Wilderness is a liminal space which contains possibilities of danger and death, rebellion and punishment, evil and temptation, worship and covenant, or in the case of 1 Kings 19, sanctuary and guidance. Keep in mind that the wilderness was also a thematic location during the Moses narrative, which we will revisit in some other sections. You'll see that Moses keeps popping up. At the end of the pericope, or chunk of text, it's just a fancy academic word, Elijah ventures to Mount Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai. This is also where God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. Scholars disagree on which particular mountain in the Sinai wilderness is the God one. However, it is agreed that whichever mountain it is symbolizes divine protection. And lastly, things. Due to the climate, trees were sparse in Elijah's environment. Thus, when a tree pops up in the biblical text, there is usually some significance. They stand as symbolic reminders of God's provision while also materially providing means for survival, like shade, which is super nice when you're in the desert. In this case, the solitary broom tree in verse 4 shades Elijah from the blazing desert sun. Once he was under the shade, Elijah lay down to sleep. In the ancient Near Eastern world, sleep was obviously a crucial activity, as it is now, but it's also an incredibly dangerous one. Elijah was traveling alone, therefore sleeping left him incredibly vulnerable to theft, abduction, death. And food acts in a similar way. Eating was significantly less dangerous, although resources were sparse in the wilderness. So more like trees in that regard. Food usually also acts as a provision from God. But food is also sometimes pleasurable. It's not all military-grade rations. The Dictionary of Biblical Imagery assures that God not only provides abundantly for their creatures, but she also provides an immense variety of pleasurable flavors, textures, colors, shapes, and smells, all of which indicate the joy and delight of the Creator with his creation. A simple hot cake on stones may not be God giving Elijah a 3-course meal, but maybe God / the angel, however you want to look at it, put some salt in it or something. Who knows? Get creative with it. Like God. A structural analysis focuses on the way a text is constructed. Structure is important because it sets a framework for the work, and analyzing that structure is important because it helps get the reader a little bit more in the mind of the authors. It is also an important step towards viewing the Bible more as a piece of literature and employing some of those skills you learned in high school English class, where you're like, okay, those are sentences. They're strung together in an intentional way. Oh, look at where that paragraph breaks. I wonder if that means something. An example of one very common, large-scale structural analysis is 3-act structure or the hero's journey. Although it is far from the only structure. Nevertheless, I personally have had 3-act structure shoved down my throat in my undergraduate film program, and I'm now accustomed to stories coming in 3s. Yet, 1 Kings 19, 1-8 comes in sets of 2s. In this section, I will be comparing 3. I can't get the number 3 out of my head. But I will be comparing and contrasting 3 scholars' structural analyses, and then also providing my own, which makes 4, which is divisible by 2, so I'm still not breaking the rules that are arbitrary that I have set for myself. So it's really fine if I break these supposed rules. First up, we have Samuel DeVries University. I don't know. So, I'm sorry, I've got all this, I've got my computer here I'm looking at. I have to use my phone as a microphone because the cord for my stunken, stupid microphone has stopped working, so I had to order a replacement. It was inexpensive, but it's going to take a while to get here. Anywho, Samuel DeVries. Within Samuel DeVries' analysis, we see 2 major events: Elijah's resignation and Elijah's transportation. Both of these events are split down into 2 more categories. Within Elijah's resignation, we see themes of direct cause and effect. Elijah is threatened through abusive political force, so he flees into the desert. There in the desert, he abandons the Lord's land, which causes his loss of role and affects his own will to live. However, in Elijah's transportation section, the text plays with 2s in a slightly different way. I think that transportation doesn't properly encompass the underlying theme here. Elijah isn't just gearing up for another journey. He is being reminded of his very purpose and revived from his deeply existential despair. It's a direct response to his flight. Because he runs away, the angel appears and prompts his revival. Next, we have Chun Leon Sao. Again, I quoted him prior as well. And I found that he did a better job at naming the 2 halves of Elijah's dark night of the soul. However, in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, which is where his work on this pericope is found, there isn't a structure and a really easy to find outline as it was for Samuel DeVries. Instead, I think I've probably popped it up on the screen, there's subheadings in his analysis, so I don't really know what to put here. It's not broken down as much. So he still has, the 2 halves, and that's kind of it. However, there is a slight difference in where he creates that split. Sal cuts the first portion early at 1 Kings 19, 1 through 3a, first half of 3, right as Elijah initially flees. From there, Sal definitively names 1 Kings 19, 3b to 8a as 2 epiphanies in the desert, emphasizing these 2 epiphanies, or angel encounters, as the most important part of the section. Fills in the gaps where DeVries failed, in my opinion. However, Sal almost overcorrects, only highlighting the 2 epiphanies discounts Elijah's intentional solitude and his journey deep into the wilderness. This is exacerbated by how Sal links Elijah's continuing journey to Mount Horeb with the next narrative chunk by cutting off verse 8 in the middle and not including going to Mount Horeb. This can make sense if you're looking at the whole story and not just verses 1 through 8, because it does continue on to a scene that takes place on that mountain. But still, by cutting it short there, he diminishes the mosaic wilderness imagery already present in Elijah's story. Because the next story is like a super Moses moment, and you're like, okay, are we plagiarizing ourselves at this point? Like, he's on Mount Sinai, like, talking to God. They're really not being subtle. But being in the wilderness is also kind of a Moses thing to do. Next, we have Burke Along. And this was the most comprehensive structural analysis, for sure. And it's found in the forms of the Old Testament literature. So Burke Along splits the pericope up into 2 main elements, but with many subcategories. I've abridged the analysis since he splits some of the verses down into fourths, which is far too intricate of analysis for the sake of this kind of project here. But the most interesting facet to this analysis, I think, is the establishment of a setting followed by an important event that happened there. For example, in the account of Elijah's flight to Beersheba, you can see it sets up the setting in verse 1 of Ahab's report to Jezebel. It's kind of like an establishing shot in a movie. And then Jezebel's message to Elijah is almost like that cause, initiating moment of kicking the action along, of sending that oath of death of like, I'm gonna kill you. And then the result, the effect, is that Elijah gets the hell out of there in verse 3. And I think that this setting event can also explain why there's so many sets of 2s throughout the narrative. It's more than cause and effect. Like a good stand-up routine, it's setup and follow through. And then my own little analysis. Hey, it's me. It's not that different from the other way that the scholars split up the text. I just labeled it a little differently. But we have, for the first part, Elijah panics at the disco. So A, there's a, when will you learn that your actions have consequences?
When will you learn? When will you learn that your actions have consequences?
Essentially like, hey, you killed all these people, you're gonna get killed now, and then that's the cause, and the effect is, why are you running?
Why are you running? Why are you running?
To Beersheba and beyond. Then Elijah rests, first for restoration, a little recovery and a recharge situation going on, and then for, sorry, about to pull Hannah Williamson, but for revival, okay? And this kind of hints some more at some theological implications I'm going to get into. It's really kind of hard to split everything up in these different sections because they all bleed into each other in certain ways, and different analyses of like, I'm doing my structural and it reminds me of theological implications, and then I'm about to talk about comparing translations and that reminded me of the structural. It's wild trying to do all of this, and it's also wild trying to use my phone as a microphone. I'm sure I got way too close at certain points and way too far away, and it's going to be a nightmare to balance. So Bear with me, please. Thank you. 1 Kings 19, 1 through 8, wasn't written in English, as is, the rest of the Bible. None of it was written in English. And in the case of 1 Kings 19, 1 through 8, it was written in ancient Hebrew. Thus, there are a myriad of translations. Words have semantic range. It's not as simple as just popping it into Google Translate, because a word can mean a lot of different things. However, looking at multiple translations side by side can be an incredibly enriching experience. Since looking at different translations comes on the heels of looking at the structural analysis, I couldn't help but notice how each translation chose to break off into paragraphs at different places, and it almost suggested or asserted some sort of structure that way. And I found that very compelling. So that's going to be peppered in here. Just as a good little seminarian at a Lutheran institution should, I started with the 1989 NRSV translation. Since it's the version I've been repeatedly reading since beginning my endeavor into hyperanalyzing this pericope, I struggled a little bit to see it with new eyes, so it was more like my control group. However, when I first read through the 2001 ESV, or English Standard Version, they seemed almost nearly identical, which shouldn't be a surprise since they both share a parent translation in the RSV, Revised Standard Version. There were a few minor punctuation deviations, but the main differences were more about clarity in putting it into English. So the NRSV adapted the text a little more clearly for English readers, whereas the ESV was more rigid with the Hebrew text. But still, there's some sort of translation liberties taking place. The two translations that were actually the most similar were the 1901 ASV, American Standard Version, and the 1611 KJV, King James Version. They both used old-timey language. However, the ASV stuck to one paragraph for the whole passage, whereas the KJV gave each verse its own line, which is actually what it looks like in Hebrew as well. There were some small grammar differences, but as it went on, there were more divergences. The ASV used the term Jehovah for God, which we all know how I feel about that. I made a video about Jehovah being kind of a nonsense word. Whereas the KJV translates to the common English choice for the Tetragrammaton, which is Lord. However, in verse 8, the ASV said that Elijah went on the strength of that food, and the KJV said meat. I don't really know why that choice was made, but it is interesting, I guess. It's the only one that I looked at that did meat. Maybe the KJV writers just really hated vegetarians. I don't know. Next up was the 2011 CEB, or Common English Bible. The first thing I noticed was how the translation specifically mentioned those who were killed as prophets of Baal. This differed from most other translations, actually. It's also peculiarly split into paragraphs in the middle of verse 5, implying that the break in ideas occurs when the angel appears for the first time, not when Elijah ventures out into the wilderness. True to its name, the CEB took a few liberties with the text in order to make it more accessible to English readers. Examples of such are how Elijah ran for his life in verse 3 rather than went, or how he saw flatbread instead of cake, so that readers don't imagine a birthday cake rather than what was likely a piece of flatbread. I found the 1973 NIV, New International Version, the most structurally interesting. They grouped together verses 1 and 2 as sort of a Jezebel scene. Next, they grouped verses 3, 4, and 5a, so the first half of 5, together as Elijah giving up on his call as a prophet. In Elijah's plea to God, they translate him saying, "I have had enough, Lord." This conveys Elijah owning responsibility for his feelings, which I enjoyed. Then they group verses 5b, so the other half of 5, and 6 together as Elijah resting And then finally, they grouped verses 7 and 8 together as Elijah resting again. The 1996 NLT, New Living Translation, was very similar to the NIV regarding structure. The only real variation is that they kept all of verse 5 with 6 rather than with 4. Like the CEB, the NLT also specified the prophets as devoted to Baal. However, the NLT clarified the escalation in Jezebel's threat, stating, "May the gods strike me and even kill me," which added specificity to the statement for sure. The NLT also used, "I have had enough, Lord," in verse 4, just as the NIV did. But in verse 6, they put a fun little exclamation point after jar of water. Like a little surprise. Oh my gosh, water! I personally enjoyed that added little bit of flair. The most interesting aspect of the NLT came in verse 8 when they translated Mount Horeb, which is what it is in the Hebrew, to Mount Sinai, since they are the same place. And this furthers the allusions to Moses in the narrative for casual readers who might not have immediately picked up on that. Since the 2009 ILB, Inclusive Language Bible, aims to be an egalitarian translation, I'm curious if that is why they translated attendant as opposed to servant, like in the other versions in verse, I didn't write this down, but I think it's verse 3 or 4. I've read this passage too much. The ILB kept the passage simple as just one paragraph, but it always used the tetragrammaton, like they did YHWH when mentioning God. And this is how the Hebrew reads. However, I worry for Christian readers who may not know the reverence for the holy name of God in Judaism to just say it willy-nilly. One thing I did appreciate is how they handled verse 4. Instead of Elijah asking for death, he prayed that he might die. I really liked this translation choice because it brings readers into the text. After all, speaking to God is praying. And at least to me, praying indicates a certain vulnerability and maybe even desperation, which is also very present in Elijah's condition. Since I am my own scholar, I created my own 2022 Funky Kunkel version, FKV if you will. I did this translation prior to analyzing the other one so I wouldn't be swayed too much. And it goes like this. Ahab told Jezebel all which Elijah had done, and all the prophets which he killed with the sword. So Jezebel sent a prophet to Elijah, saying, "Thus may the gods do to me, and even more, if I don't end your breath like you did to one of them by this time tomorrow." Elijah looked and arose and departed for his life and came to Beersheba in Judah and left his servant there. But Elijah went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat under a broom tree and asked if his breath could die, saying, "Enough now, Lord! Take my breath away, because I am no better than my ancestors." He lay down and slept under a broom tree. But an angel appeared and nudged him and said to him, "Arise, eat." At his head, a cake baked on hot stones and a jug of water appeared. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of I Am returned and nudged him again and said, "Arise, eat. The journey will be great for you." He arose and ate and drank and went on the strength of the food for 40 days and nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And my translation was quite clunky. There are different things that I would probably, cut out or smush together, kind of make them more concise and readable. So perhaps an RFKV, revised Kunkel version, will be, hitting stores soon. No, I'm not going to translate the Bible. It's a lot of work. But all in all, no two translations were exactly the same, and the more I read them, the more differences I found. So biblical scholarship sure isn't for the faint of heart or the fragile of ego, because you're gonna make mistakes, and other people made mistakes. It's It's just Error City. Do not focus on the books. Focus on me, camera. Focus on me.
No.
Well, friends, we have arrived. It is my favorite type of analysis, the literary analysis, reading the Bible as a story. It's finally time to situate 1 Kings 19, 1 through 8, in its greater biblical narrative. So let's revisit Elijah, shall we? Prior to the decline of Elijah's mental health, he is riding a high from his victorious smiting against the prophets of Baal on God's behalf. If you don't know the story, it's in 1 Kings 18, and basically he rallies up like 400 and something of Baal's prophets and taunts the hell out of them. And he's like, hey, you should light this altar on fire. Can you do it? Can you do it? Can you do it? Why isn't it happening? And then finally, it comes time for his little moment. He's like, pour water on this altar. Pour it again. Pour it again. And then God sets it on fire. And he's like, see, my God's the cool one. And then kills all the prophets. And this all takes place on a mountain called Mount Carmel. And it also royally pisses off the royals in Israel. And 1 Kings 19 explores the consequences of Elijah's previous actions. However, if Elijah is as strong as the fire on Mount Carmel conveys, why did such a bombastic man shrink? Because he was pretty bold on that mountain. And then what we're looking at is this guy just like, kill me, God. Kill me, God. Just kill me, please. Well, the Oxford Bible Commentary explains that the struggle for the exclusive worship of the Lord and against Baalism was much more long-term and less triumphant than 1 Kings 18 suggests. A fact reflected in Elijah's sudden need to flee.
Real quick, I do want to say this language of Baalism doesn't sit right with me because it was a whole other religion and it feels very diminishing to just add ism at the end of a word. It also has vibes of like wokeism. So that terminology I don't know about, but the rest of the quote, solid.
Thus, when Ahab and Jezebel hear about the slaughter of the prophets of Baal, they aren't magically converted. Instead, they retaliate. Curiously, Jezebel sends a messenger to threaten Elijah, vowing to kill him. The New Interpreter's Bible, Volume 3, problematizes this action. Chun Lian Sao, I'm really quoting this fellow a lot, but he writes, yet if that is what she really wanted to do, that is, killing Elijah, it seems strange that she does not simply send an assassin to finish him off or a bailiff to arrest him. Instead, she tips him off, giving him time to escape. Perhaps Jezebel is playing mind games or found it more politically profitable for Elijah to simply flee on his own rather than getting her own hands dirty. The text isn't clear. Regardless, Sao resolves that one must not press the details too hard, however, for this is not so much a historical report as it is literature. This introductory account simply sets up the rest of the story. Simply put, Elijah's motive doesn't matter because the ploy works. Elijah is utterly terrified. This carries the story forth. As we now know, Elijah flees southward to the land of Judah. More particularly, he flees to Beersheba. He leaves his servant there, nodding to Elijah's belief that he is utterly alone. Without his servant, he can die in peace. So he continues even further south into the desert. This creates a turning point in the story. Elijah, as the burnt-out prophet, begs for death. We see him at his lowest point, in great contrast to every other version of Elijah we find in the text. There are hints of his drama here still, but not of his confidence. In the greater Elijah story, we find him in the abyss. In response to Elijah giving up, an angel appears to him. At first, there's a bit of a red herring that's kind of fun in the Hebrew. So the word malach appears in this pericope 3 times. And in this particular instance, it is usually translated to mean messenger. However, what type of messenger, do you ask? Well, it could be a prophet, or a priest, or an angel. Pretty wide semantic range. Sal explores the implications of this semantic range through analyzing the Hebrew. In the account of the first epiphany, we read only of an angel, which is noteworthy because the word for angel, malach, is the same one used for Jezebel's messenger in verse 2. Rhetorically, this ambiguity heightens the tension. For the reader is momentarily uncertain whether the mysterious intermediary will bring death, which Jezebel had promised, and which Elijah had quested, or whether the intermediary will somehow deliver Elijah from his persecutor and from himself. However, if Jezebel was the one that sent this messenger, this malach that appears the second time, why would they leave him a nice meal? Poison? I don't know. For the reader who might be reading this for the first time, they're like, I'm confused, but I'm intrigued for sure. I think in verse 2, with malach being a messenger, but could also be a prophet or a priest, it would be pretty metal if it was one of Baal's prophets being the one threatening Elijah, being like someone that got away or someone who like all of their friends were killed by this man, being like, and also, you're going down, buddy. Just you wait. However, in the wilderness encounter, the second time, it makes sense for it to be an actual angel, especially since in the biblical text, angels are real living beings. They are supernatural and non-physical, but may assume a corporeal appearance for a period of time. Angels are therefore not symbols of another reality. In one sense, however, an angel is an image of the invisible God. In all, exploring different meanings for malach here makes the story that much richer. The fake out is fun, but in the second epiphany, the third time malach is used, the angel is clarified as an angel of God, confirming that the latter is true. God will provide. It's not Jezebel being like, yeah, you prayed to God to get killed, you're getting murked. And God provides for Elijah here in 2 important ways. Mordechai Cogan clarifies that the epiphanies aren't from 2 different angels, as we see is, clarified, but rather they serve 2 different purposes. The second meal was concerned with future needs, i.e. the long trek to Horeb. The first one was for past needs, i.e. the self-inflicted fast Elijah had undertaken from Samaria to the wilderness of Beersheba. And Samaria was the capital of Israel at the time. Jerusalem was in Judah. Okay. Fun little geography lesson over. In this way, God meets Elijah where he is at and gives him the time he needs to heal. One break isn't enough. Elijah needs 2 meals before he can venture any further into the wilderness. This wilderness falls in line with greater callbacks to Moses' own story. Cogan notes that throughout, the narrator has creatively used motifs associated with Moses, enriching his tale with literary allusions that, at times, attain verbal resemblance to the earlier tradition. This includes Elijah's journey to Horeb that takes 40 days and nights, whereas Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights receiving the law. Additionally, Elijah's experience on Mount Horeb and Moses' experience on Mount Sinai, as I mentioned in the historical context, are arguably the same location. This leads into the next narrative, which follows Elijah's encounter with God that I've hinted at a little bit in the structural analysis. Patterns of 2s occur again as God asks Elijah twice what he is doing all the way out in the wilderness. So this is the second half part, whatever, of 1 Kings 19. The whole narrative structure fits in line with verses 1 through 8. However, it also thematically fills a nice call and response in the overall Elijah story. Before chapter 19, Elijah is bombastic and seemingly fearless. He calls upon God's raw divine power, but it makes him many enemies. Up on the mountain, God shows Elijah that they aren't just in the fire and these earthquakes, but also in the quiet. The same quiet that allowed Elijah to rest. And sandwiched between Elijah's great showdown on God's behalf and his encounter with the divine, he needed that quiet, caring God. So God provided. God's gonna meet you where you are. Because God's a lot of different things. I hated that I did that. Also, yes, the lighting is completely different. My camera battery died. I need to get a rechargeable one. And then I went downstairs and then came back, and the sun came out from behind the thunderstorm. So that's why this happened. Okay, to the last section. Let's go. Theological implications. Hi, hello, I'm in a church. So exegesis pulls out all of the meaning in a text. Theology sorts through it and sort of spits out what it all means about God and what it all means about humanity now. At least that's my take on the difference between the two. Thus, theology comes last. First, we did deep exegetical study, and now we get a little theology as a treat. This fosters responsible theology. So, after studying 1 Kings 19, 1-8 for months, here's what I've learned about God from it, and also what it means for humanity in the here and now. One thing that I didn't mention in the sections before, because I didn't know where to squeeze it in, is that Elijah had predicted a drought to Ahab in one of his first appearances in the Bible, and call him That's So Raven, because that drought did in fact happen. It did. Thus, all of Elijah's stories occurred during a time of exasperated trouble. Fact-checking myself, it wasn't all of the stories. 1 Kings 19, 1-8 actually took place after the drought ended, because right after the showdown on Mount Carmel, it started pouring rain. But still, it was extra worse in the first half. It's extra hot, there's famine, there is unrest, and political corruption. Everything keeps compiling. Sound familiar? The systematic erasure of queer people through legislation, racism in all its insidious forms, the fact that society doesn't view disabled people as fully human. Add all of that in with financial insecurity and a global pandemic that's constantly putting everyday routine in flux. It's so overwhelming, it becomes paralyzing. It's really no surprise that Elijah became exhausted, and it's no surprise that we're exhausted either. Trying to keep up with it all, make a change, a positive difference, it seems fucking impossible. Now, I'm not trying to compare myself too much to Elijah. He's one of the greats. It would be like Rachel Hollis comparing herself to Harriet Tubman.
What is it about me that made you think I want to be relatable? No, sis.
It's just not the move. However, hi, hello, Burnout and I are very familiar with each other. I'd say we're friends, but it's not a pleasant relationship. You may have noticed that my posting schedule has taken quite the hit this semester, and it's honestly because I've been overwhelmed and undermotivated for a myriad of reasons, some admittedly way less noble than being concerned about the world. I'm not trying to claim some martyr complex for having a God YouTube channel, but rather to say, hey, are you tired? Do you want a nap and a snack? Me too. So did Elijah, and that's okay. It's been a bit of a ride since, but perhaps you recall my thesis at the beginning, that through this intense exegetical study, one finds God's historic care for those fleeing power and crying out in the wilderness. And Elijah did just that. He fled from power and called out in the wilderness just as Moses before him, after he killed that Egyptian guard, and also he led the Israelites out of Egypt. You get it, you've seen Prince of Egypt. Fun fact, I myself am a fraud who has never seen Prince of Egypt. And Hagar before him, when she fled Sarah's wrath in Genesis. Even people after Elijah, let's take it to the New Testament. I hate to do this to y'all, but the New Testament, we've got John the Baptist. He was like, fuck whatever's going on. I'm going to just hang out in the wilderness and be radical. And Jesus is like, you got to go in the wilderness for a bit and get tested and stuff or whatever. Like, it's not something that just stopped with Elijah. And it's not something that just stopped with Jesus in the Old Testament. It's happening to us right here, right now. God provided for all of them. So just maybe God will provide for you in your anguish amidst oppression, and even on days of just general suckiness where Daniel Powder's bad day really feels like a deep cut. 'Cause you had a bad day. And you're invalidating your own negative feelings because, wow, so many people have it so much worse. But 1 Kings 19, 1-8 shows us that God cares about all our feelings, even the icky ones. God cares when you don't want to get out of bed because the world is so overwhelming you just want to cry for a few hours. God cares when maybe instead you're numbing those feelings and just pushing through. God cares when you're oscillating between the two. God provides for you the space to simply exist in spite of a world that sees you as a productivity vessel, because God cares about you beyond what you can produce. God cared about Elijah beyond his mountaintop showdowns and what he can do as a prophet. God supported Elijah's need to rest twice because, yes, we get knocked down. We gotta get back up again. I get knocked down, but I get up again. You're never gonna keep me down. I get knocked down. There is that second meal to get Elijah back on his feet, because staying down forever also isn't a very good solution. But first, there was rest for the sake of rest. You're allowed to spend some time on the ground before you get back at him. That grief is sacred. It's healing. It's necessary. And God is with you in it all. Amen. I felt like I needed to say it. Amen. Whew. Okay, that was a lot. But here we are. We're at the end of it all. Thank you so much for watching it all the way through and hearing my nerdy little ramblings. I'm so incredibly grateful for you all. If you really like my content, I have a Patreon if you'd like to support me there. I also have a Ko-fi for more one-time donation types of things. But if that is not a financially viable option for you, that is 100% okay. Just watching this video, sharing it with a friend, that all does a lot of help for my channel. Hi, I keep forgetting to mention that I also have merch. And this is partially because, full transparency, I originally said that the funds for that merch would go to going on a school trip to the Holy Land. Well, the trip is currently happening right now, and as you can see, I'm not on it. It is because I could not afford it, but that money is still either going to go towards the trip that's happening again in 2 years that hopefully I'll be able to go on, or directly to my education. But I said the money would be going to something, and it's obviously not going to that, so I wanted to give a bit of an update. That was my dog snoring really loudly, if you could hear that. But if you are interested in merch, I have there's a short sleeve shirt, a long sleeve shirt, and a sweatshirt, all with the just Faith Evolving logo. That's all I have right now, but I think they're pretty cool. I have a shirt. I wear it often. I'm always like, I wore it to the airport a few times. I was like, can I have a YouTube channel? Airport? Check me out. No, I don't think anyone did, but anywho, I do have merch. And good news is the semester is over, and so now, with the onset of this video, I'm going back to a weekly schedule. Very excited to just bring a bunch of content and really dive into a bunch of video ideas that I've had that I've been storing away because I haven't had time to make them. And all in all, you know what? Next time someone says the Bible is so easy to understand, or the Bible clearly says, just send them this video. Because this is like a 0.000 something, I did the math at one point, % of the Bible, and you could just go wild bonkers analyzing just that little portion. It's really a rabbit hole. You just go down and down and down and down, and that is what it's like to be a Bible student, if you're not just getting apologetics beaten over your head. Okay, I feel like I'm getting annoying, so we're gonna wrap this puppy up. I'd like to give a substantially large, oh my gosh, thank you to my patron saints of Faith Evolving. Y'all are so amazing, and I'm so thankful. And keep an eye out for more content. Go take a nap, or go eat a snack. Take care of yourself. Okay, thank you for watching. Bye.